Recording in progress.
All right, I'd like to call the June 13th, 2022 regular meeting of the Shoreline City Council to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Scully.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Robertson.
Here.
Councilmember Ramsdale.
Present.
Councilmember McConnell.
Here.
Councilmember Mark.
Here.
Councilmember Poby.
Here.
Councilmember Roberts.
Councilmember Roberts is present. May not have heard his name called. All right, I am happy to announce that this is that we're proclaiming the day as Juneteenth. Juneteenth commemorates the day that General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, and informed enslaved African Americans that the Civil War and slavery had ended. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued 2.5 years earlier on January 1st, 1863, and declared that all persons held as slaves are free, but slavery had been maintained in Texas. Juneteenth, also known as Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, and Liberation Day, is celebrated nationally as the end of chattel slavery. Recognition of Juneteenth is an opportunity to learn more about our history and address current manifestations of racism in ourselves, institutions, and systems. City Council Resolution number 467 stated the city's commitment to Shoreline becoming an anti-racist community, which includes addressing all the ways racism persists as a system and a chronic reality. Therefore, we proclaim June 19th, 2022 as Juneteenth. Next up is approval of the agenda. Are there any requested changes? Seeing none, the agenda is approved as proposed. Report of the city manager. Ms. Terry?
Thank you, Mayor. Just give it a minute for it to come up. As the mayor just stated, on June 19th, we'll be celebrating Juneteenth. And in celebration of Juneteenth, artists Myron Curry and Vincent Keel have painted a new mural on the wall of the Shoreline Secure Storage property on Midvale and North 178th Street, which is owned by the city. Featured on the mural is a portrait of Ida B. Wells Barnett. Wells Barnett was born into slavery during the Civil War. During her lifetime, she battled sexism, racism, and violence as a prominent journalist and activist. This mural joins a mural completed for Juneteenth last year. A big thank you to the artists for their work. The glass replacement for the interurban pedestrian bridges at Aurora Avenue North and North 155th Street began this past weekend and it is scheduled to be completed next weekend. Pedestrians and bicyclists will still be able to access the bridges, but are urged to use caution in the work areas. Traffic revisions will be in place and delays may be possible. Please use alternate routes if you are able, and if you must drive through the area, reduce your speed and drive cautiously to keep everyone safe. Thank you in advance for your patience as the bridges are restored after being vandalized last year. A reminder that this is the final week to participate in a couple of our open surveys and open houses. The first is the Climate Action Plan survey. We are in the process of updating the Climate Action Plan, which outlines key actions the city will take to reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions and prepare our community for the impacts of climate change. The Climate Action Plan will identify climate action strategies that also improve equity, increase community resilience, and protect ecosystems in Shoreline. Your voice is important and will help us make sure that the actions we take to fight climate change benefit everyone in the community. You can visit shorelinewa.gov/climate through June 19th to share your feedback. And the second open house opportunity closing this week is the 145th Street Project's virtual open house. The 145th Street corridor is a major east-west route that connects South Shoreline and North Seattle neighborhoods to businesses, parks, and services. The work along 145th Street will improve intersection safety, reduce traffic, and add better pedestrian and bicycle access. Join us through June 15th to learn more about the project updates, designs, visuals, and the construction schedule for the 145th Street corridor and the 145th Street and I-5 interchange projects. You can visit shorelinewa.gov/145 projects. And join the Shoreline Historical Museum for a Shoreline Walks event exploring the history and art of the Hillwood and Richmond Highlands neighborhoods. The Shoreline Walks program is free and designed for adults ages 50+, but open to all ages and abilities. No need to sign up, just show up at the Shoreline Historical Museum parking lot on Saturday at 10 a.m. Learn more at shorelinewa.gov/shoreline walks. And a couple of public reminders. The Planning Commission will hold a hybrid remote in-person meeting on Thursday, it's not June 19th because that's Sunday. Anyway, this Thursday at 7 p.m. in the council chambers, and the agenda is economic development forecast. And then the Parks Tree Board will hold a remote meeting on Thursday, June 23rd at 7 p.m. via Zoom. You can look for more information about these meetings and other events at happenings. Visit the city's calendar at shorelinewa.gov/calendar. And just a public reminder that City Hall will be closed on Monday, June 20th in recognition of the Juneteenth holiday. There will be no council meeting on June 20th, and the next city council meeting will be held on Monday, June 27th. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Terry. Next up are council reports. Are there any council reports? Deputy Mayor Roberts.
Thank you, Mayor. On June 9th, I participated in the North King County Coalition on Homelessness meeting. A big part of the meeting was the King County Regional Homeless Authority kind of giving us a preview of their upcoming budget, which includes some additional money to address gaps, create places for people, and support the existing system. A number of things there. I won't go into all the details, but a really big chunk, I thought this was interesting, is going to their severe weather and emergency response efforts. Specifically as we approach the hot season and we see what's happening in the rest of the country. We know what happened here last year. The need for not just space, but space that might also need to be equipped with air conditioning as an example. So big potential cost item that they're budgeting for. But really the ask is, and what I need to bring back to you eventually once it's written, is an ILA for all the North King County cities that will be coming back. I don't have it yet. But one of the ideas is really that we consider taking our current allocations for homeless services within the city of Shoreline, and those recommendations will be coming to us later in the next budget process, that we consider having the King County Regional Homeless Authority basically handle those accounts for us and honor directly the accounts that we have, the commitments that we have to local organizations, but we allow them to administer that in that first year of the biennium, and then the second one. Anyway, so that increasing authority to the Regional Homeless Authority to administer those funds with our guidance. So that's a preview of coming attractions. I'll bring that ILA back to us at some point when it's ready for council review. Thank you.
Thank you. Other council reports? All right, well, tonight on the consent calendar, we're going to be appointing new youth members of the Parks and Tree Board. And I want to just take a minute to thank an outgoing member who is off to a new adventure. David Lynn served 2 years on the Parks Board. In addition to that, he was very engaged at Shorewood High, selected as this year's homecoming king at Shorewood. He was appreciated by other board members for his level of engagement and offered thoughtful comments and feedback during his time on the board. He's going to be starting pre-med courses at UC Berkeley this fall, and I would like to thank him for his 2 years of service to Shoreline and wish him all the best in his next adventure. Next up is public comment. It's an opportunity for the public to comment on either agenda items or anything of concern. There are 7 people signed up, so it's 3 minutes per person. We ask that individuals start their comments with their name and city of residence, and we're going to take the folks who have signed up in person first, and then the folks who have signed up for online in the order they signed up. Do we have anybody signed up in person?
No one has signed up in person.
Okay. Let's go ahead and do the online then. I think Mr. Banneker is first.
Yes, the first speaker is Brandy Banneker.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Mayor Scully, members of the Shoreline City Council, thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. I'm Randy Banneker. I'm here on behalf of the Seattle King County Realtors. Tonight you're discussing the possibility of developing a set of tenant protections for the city. And we just wanted to urge caution and careful consideration of that. Shoreline you have spent as a council a lot of time on housing affordability and an interest in creating new moderately priced housing options in Shoreline. In addition to creating those affordable and attainable units, it's important to retain existing rental units that are naturally affordable. And a large portion of those existing naturally affordable rental units are owned by small mom and pop landlords, and they own about 1 to 5 units. These people tend to keep their rents moderate in order to keep the units rented. They're not wealthy investors, but regular people who've invested in their community for education, retirement, what have you. Many of our members work with these folks, and they're hearing about tremendous financial strain and uncertainty that added tenant protections place on them in terms of meeting the mortgage, paying sometimes double-digit increases in property taxes, and increasing utility rates. These bills are due whether or not tenants are paying the rent, frankly. If those people are pushed to sell, their properties will be subjected to market rate redevelopment with increased rents and less affordability. In the big picture, we worry that added constraints on those small landlords will push up rents by getting the small folks, the mom and pop folks, out of the business. We believe that the tenant protections added by the state legislature 2 sessions ago are robust. And we ask that you consider contributions by the small mom and pop rental housing owners to make affordable housing in Shoreline and continue to offer it. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Banneker.
Next is Marilyn Yim.
Good evening, council members. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. My name is Marilyn Yim. I live in Seattle, but we bought our first house in Shoreline that we still retain as a rental for the last 20 years. My husband and I are small mom and pop housing providers, and our kids attend Shoreline schools. So we've been a part of this community for a very long time. Because we live in the city of Seattle, we've also dealt with Seattle's heavy-handed legislation for the last 6 years. From my experience, the proposals that are under consideration today will not create more housing or make Shoreline more affordable. In fact, it will lead to an exodus of small mom and pop housing providers like myself and a sharp reduction in the affordable rentals that we offer. Key stakeholders have been excluded from the process of drafting these proposals and from vetting them anywhere that they have been considered around our county. Rental Housing Association of Washington, property managers who represent people like me, and real estate brokers and agents are missing from your stakeholder list. And I can tell you from experience, every single small mom and pop provider that I know in the city of Seattle has an exit strategy. Every single one of them is figuring out a way to get out because of the heavy-handed legislation that is just dealing a 1-2 punch to them after, dealing with a 2-year COVID eviction moratorium where they've had to bear the brunt of housing people without much assistance from our government, frankly. So real estate brokers and agents and the property managers have a much closer relationship to what's going on, and they can tell you firsthand before you would ever see it in any data what they're seeing among their clients. And what we've heard from them is all of their clients in Seattle are selling. But the data that Seattle has right now is that 11% of their rental housing in just 8 months have been sold and are taken off the rolls. And they are not being replaced fast enough by new housing, new construction, or anything like that. 94% of those lost units were owned by the small mom and pops like me. And we own and operate half of all rental housing across the United States. It's also costing the city dearly. SDCI, the department that manages this, is at least $1 million over budget every year. They're so far underwater that they aren't even answering their renting in Seattle hotline for tenants or for landlords, and they're not returning messages. The legislation that you're considering isn't based on need. There's no income or affordability requirement. It would be much more sensible to target that help to people who actually need it, rather than causing a blanket disruption to your entire housing market. With the loss of affordable family-sized housing, renters in this city will lose. Housing providers include union members and working people just like myself. But regionally, we've just been shut out of the legislative process. So I would ask you to really don't advance this if at all possible. But if this does proceed to a discussion, it really needs to have a robust discussion, including all of the stakeholders, particularly those who operate rental housing, and can tell you how our business actually does operate and how we're a benefit to the community, frankly. We need to retain what we have as well as build more. Thank you so much for your consideration. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Yim.
Next is Will Tosberg.
Hi, Council. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks. My name is Will Tosburn. I'll be speaking to the tenant protection legislation agenda item as well. I'm the community policy specialist at Solid Ground. We're an anti-poverty service provider and advocacy organization that serves King County. And one of our programs that we serve statewide is the statewide tenant hotline, in which renters from across the state can call in to speak with tenant counselors about their tenancy situation. The conversations that I and our tenant counselors are having with King County and Shoreline renters make it clear just how difficult the conditions are for renters in our communities. Eviction moratoriums have lifted, rental assistance goes to the landlords, rents are spiking, and that is all happening in a housing market that provides less and less affordable and accessible options. Housing instability and evictions are traumatic and damaging experiences and oftentimes lead to homelessness. This issue is happening right now. It is urgent. And Shoreline City Council should add the issue of protecting tenants to the 2022-2024 work plan. The protections you all are discussing today are common sense policies that will give renters a chance to maintain housing or be able to find housing if they are forced to move because of spiking rents. These policies will not significantly affect the operations of most landlords and especially those who provide fair housing. I did just want to add a couple notes on the staff report too. The city of Kenmore has passed a number of these critical protections and is going to be debating the passage of more tonight. By passing these protections, Shoreline will be joining a movement of renters and leaders and policymakers in Kenmore, Auburn, Burien, Seattle, and throughout King County who have realized the real need to urgently make our local housing systems more fair. I think that I just want to end by saying, it is really important that we listen and center the perspectives of those people that are most impacted by a housing system that is more and more out of reach. Renter protections can keep folks stable. That keeps kids in the same schools. That keeps communities growing and thriving. This is about people's lives. This isn't about investments or profit. This is about people trying to be able to survive and maintain and build a home in Shoreline and in the communities in King County. So I really hope that we keep that centered. A lot of the things that we just heard, I think, are from a very specific perspective, and I'd love to discuss more some of those claims. But it's really important that I hope we hear and that you all take the time to listen to the renters in your community. I know that Shoreline is becoming an increasingly diverse place, but it's also becoming a place where it's much, much harder to afford rent. I saw that in the data that was presented last week. So it's really important that we center renters and not just the folks that make money off of people trying to live and trying to build community. So thank you very much for considering this critical issue. I really urge you to act on this quickly, and I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tosburn.
The next person signed up is Corinne Stipek McKisson. However, I do not see Ms. McKisson in the list. If you're here, would you raise your hand, please?
All right, we'll return to her at the end.
Okay, so next is Jackie Curley.
Yes, hi, good evening. It's Jackie Curley, longtime Shoreline resident. Wanted to underscore what folks have shared around tenant protections, and I think that's important. I also think it's important to continue transparent reporting on the experiences at the Oaks Enhanced Shelter, just to see how it's going and make sure the operations are running as seamlessly as possible and serving as many folks as can be served. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Curley.
Kathleen Russell is next.
Kathleen Russell, resident of Shoreline. Regarding sidewalk designs, per February 7 council meeting minutes, council members emphasized the importance of listening to the opinions of the public early in the process, end quote. And one of the goals in the Washington State GMA is encourage the participation of citizens in the planning process. Public outreach to the city regarding the new sidewalk on 20th Avenue Northwest includes emails to council, project manager, city engineer, public comments at council meetings on February 7 and June 6, Save Shoreline Trees correspondence dated May 16, including 7 questions emailed to staff with a copy to council. Letter to council from Save Shoreline Trees dated June 2nd, 2022. The June 2022 update to the city website states, The city is reviewing location and width to find the best solution to balance costs, impacts, and usability for people of all ages and abilities. Save Shoreline Trees response. As stated in public comments on June 6, a continuous 8-foot wide sidewalk satisfies the criteria: less cost than a 10-foot wide sidewalk, less impact to tree roots, and is usable by people of all ages and abilities. In addition, we have concerns regarding the 3 trees, 1 large madrone and 2 Douglas firs at the northwest 190th corner. Per the city arborist report, these trees are likely to be heavily impacted by row improvements. Save Shoreline Trees encourages residents to take the city survey, available on the city website until June 25th. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Russell.
Derek Blackwell is next.
Hello, my name is Derek Blackwell. I live close by to the newly proposed apartment building on Linden Avenue North to replace Garden Park Apartments. You're probably tired of hearing me going on about moral challenges. As you know by now, emergency vehicle and traffic safety are my #1 concerns, but there are several problems I haven't even mentioned yet. In case you were not aware, most of the current renters at Garden Park are Section 8. When I first heard the news, I called the pastor at Next Door Friends Church and the director of Ronald Commons nearby. They both assured me there's nothing anyone can do to fight for these folks to keep their current homes, or you would have heard more about this sooner. Considering the minimum number of affordable units being planned for the new upscale development, this is, of course, shameful. I don't have much to say about it since I've been focusing my time on issues I can actually make a difference about. I hope you received an email from me today with pictures of the trees at the current development. The subject line is pictures of trees. I think it reached you about 3 o'clock today. The trees mean a lot to the residents and the neighbors nearby. They're quite healthy. The good people with Save Shoreline Trees tell me there's little to be done to save these trees, and that's shameful. Let me take this moment to say I fully support their actions. Keeping only 10% of the trees standing near a tall building seems meager, and the very least you could support. I see no reason buildings can't be a little smaller and we keep more trees, or have 45 days notice if trees will be cut, but we can't seem to manage 14. Thank you, Councilmember Ramsdale. Last week you mentioned the mental health issues caused by lack of open spaces and the need for a 2% park impact fee. Another mental health issue comes from construction disturbance. Some neighbors, myself included, are already in a state of despair about this. Some of us own condos only 200 feet away from the construction site. We are told this will take 3 years. All of this coming on the heels of the pandemic is very disturbing. We're not fully recovered yet. If anyone wants to sell and get out, they're already too late. Nobody wants to buy a condo or a house so close to a project this huge that will take 3 years to build. Many of us work at home. I myself am at risk. I really need the isolation, but I may have to go rent an office. I don't think I'll be able to take the noise all day. Landlords will be in big trouble finding renters. The construction would be a major disturbance for all who live nearby: Shorewood High School, Friends Church, Ronald Commons, Brotherton Cadillac, and let's not forget about Fire Department headquarters. It's been illuminating to hear the testimony about beach access. The people who live down by the shore don't face these problems. Please don't forget about the little people, and please alert whoever can make a statement about safety to Mill Creek Residential. They need to provide another vehicle entrance. That's the very least they can do. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. Did Ms. McKisson appear?
She emailed me saying that she submitted written comments and no longer needed to make oral comments.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that concludes public comments. Next up is our consent calendar. Is there a motion related to the consent calendar? Deputy Mayor Robertson.
I move we approve the consent calendar.
I second.
Will the clerk please conduct the votes?
Mayor Scully,
Aye.
Deputy Mayor Robertson,
Aye.
Councilmember Ramsdale,
Aye.
Councilmember McConnell,
Aye.
Councilmember Mork,
Aye.
Councilmember Poby,
Aye.
and Councilmember Roberts.
Aye.
All right, the consent calendar passes unanimously. Next up is study item 8A, which is a discussion of tenant protection regulations. And I believe Mr. Hammond is presenting remotely.
Thank you, Council. My apologies for just catching up on all of my technology here, but hopefully folks can see my screen now. And good evening. I am here today. My name is Jim Hammond. I am from the work for the City Manager's Office, and I am here today to give you an overview of some proposed tenant regulations. Just by way of background, outreach by advocates, tenant advocates in the community, sort of reached our city council, and Deputy Mayor Robertson, Councilmember Pobey, and later others requested that staff provide a review of this issue. This was assigned to me as it took place after the council goal setting workshop in May or March. So just, it's clear, though, that in the wake of the COVID pandemic, tenant advocates have highlighted the challenges faced by tenants in terms of retaining housing, dealing with economic dislocation. And they have reached out to Shoreline, to Kenmore, as was noted earlier in public comment, and to other jurisdictions to seek some of the supports that they believe are of great value. Just to clarify for anyone who's watching this presentation, today is a very early stage discussion as requested by council to discuss these issues. It is not legislation. It is not proposed legislation that obviously members of council would fall to you to decide how to proceed in the wake of this presentation tonight. I will go through some background information for you, and then obviously then it will be up to council to discuss this information, ask questions, and deliberate on next steps, including whether they would want to gather additional perspectives or assign some sort of staffing resource to further flesh this out. Just to be clear, it is possible that this material you'll hear today is not complete. I am one staff person who is not a specialist in this field, who has rounded up this information, and undoubtedly you will have some interest in additional information that would be part of the going forward. Let's see. It's also to note from a staffing perspective that this issue, since it came up after the goal setting work, there is no real clear staff resource identified for moving forward. So part of this prioritization would also fall to council to sort of provide direction to staff on how to move forward. And then finally, I would characterize this as a sort of a broad order of magnitude sense of the issue, given the high level nature of it. But I would invite questions. I will do my best to either answer them or acknowledge what I do or don't know, and we can try to find out more detailed answers if additional questions crop up. So next, I wanted to run through a summary of some of the tenant protections that were offered up by the advocate community to council for consideration. So I'm basically going to run through each of these very briefly. There are about 10 or so that have been offered up. Again, this is just a high-level flyover, but one is to provide a notice of rent increase. So this is when in tough economic times, the reasoning would be that if a rent increase is of significant magnitude, that the tenant would benefit from more time to get their economics together, figure out what they can do, how well they can cope with the increase or budget for it or what have you, or you secure a new dwelling potentially if it's too great an increase. This is something that has been adopted by a number of local jurisdictions. Also, too, is a cap on late fees. Late fees can be economically challenging, and if a tenant is late with rent because they're already in sort of economic difficulty, it can be compounded if there's additional fees piled on. And so many jurisdictions, some not as many as the rent increase notice thing, have capped late fees at different levels or dollar amounts as outlined in the memo. Likewise, move-in fees. There's an argument to say that to bring someone into housing, you have to limit how many fees can sort of be for move-in and for first month and for security deposit and things like that. And those fees, kind of largely considered as move-in fees, are limited in some local jurisdictions, and it's something that addresses some of the economic challenges of tenants. Because there are these advance fees and multiple months worth of fees potentially due and owing from a tenant, There are also some jurisdictions who have adopted a right to a payment plan, depending on the length of the lease and the size of the commitment. These extra months worth of payment or extra fees can be spread out over a number of months, again, usually related to the length of the lease. Then let's see, modification of due date. This is one that speaks to the question of individuals who might be on fixed income and might have a due date that's different from the first of the month that most of us might have been familiar with when we were renters or are renters. And so let's say their fixed income comes mid-month, they would have the right to request of the landlord a different due date for their rent payment cycle. This too has been adopted by some number of local jurisdictions. Some local jurisdictions too have barred discrimination due to immigration status, that this is not something that can be examined or can be a basis for denying housing. And then some local jurisdictions too have barred requirement of a social security number. The landlord may request it perhaps in some jurisdictions, but if a individual does not provide it, it cannot be a basis of denying the lease, and they can still kind of do a credit check or background check based on other information other than a social security number. And then there are some jurisdictions that also bar additional signatory requirements, such as, for example, if you have a disabled adult in the family or in the household, or an adult child, requiring those additional signatures on the lease if the primary tenant already signed the lease. These are things that are additional burdens or restrictions or requirements that in some jurisdictions are not allowed. And again, this is a question of barring equity, addressing equity concerns, and there are a handful of jurisdictions who have gone down this road. A couple of other key ones here, banning abusive, deceptive, or unfair practices. This is one that has to do with just making sure that there's no kind of hidden clauses in the leases or other ways of kind of taking advantage of tenants and their relative lack of sophistication compared to the property owner, again, adopted by some local jurisdictions. And then relocation assistance. This is something too that I'd like to offer just one factual correction from the memo, and also just a little additional clarification. In the memo, I stated that in the city of Seattle that uses this program, that assistance is triggered by a 5% increase, and that was an error on my part. It is in fact a 10% rent increase that would trigger a need for relocation assistance. And to clarify as well, this only applies to low-income tenants at 80% of area median income or below, and then those relocation fees that would be covered are charged to the landlord for making that happen. And so I do, it is important too, because relocation can come in other venues as well, such as when there's people move in, like the landlord wants to move back into the house, or it's being knocked down for a redevelopment, or it's condemned for unfit habitation. All of these have some different rules and requirements around them, really where this advocacy notion is coming from, is focusing on relocation for people who need to move because rents are really going up. So that it's this economic challenge that was the focus of this proposed measure that was shared by the advocate community for this evening's meeting. Just cause eviction is another one that has been around. Seattle's had that for many decades now, and it was recently also adopted by the state. And here's another point of clarification, just to be clear. The state does pretty much cover much of what just cause eviction is, which is to say it requires a landlord to have a valid reason for asking a tenant to leave. However, there was a loophole that was created in the state law, perhaps unintended. I'm not clear on that. But essentially, it only applies if you have a lease of a certain length or a lease that's gone month to month. And and it allows landlords to structure a lease that's from 6 months to a year in length, without any renewals, and doesn't go month to month by the terms of the lease. It would not be subject to this just cause eviction protection. So the local action would be to essentially plug that loophole, and that's the ask of that aspect of this advocacy model ordinance would be to clean up just cause eviction in that regard. And then rental registration and inspection are programs to actually capture, through a registration program, all of the units for rent in a given jurisdiction. And that alone is one aspect that is done. Others go further, other jurisdictions go even further to have an inspection program accompanied with that where city staff would be able to review specific units for habitability and have some enforcement mechanism to ensure that they are in sufficient shape to be rented out to others. And then kind of going with that are some jurisdictions bar increases in rent if properties are in that poor condition. And so it obviously needs an inspection to adjudge the condition before you can bar the rent increases, but those kind of all fit together. And then there was an interesting one called Right to Live with Family. As I understand it, it comes out of a case in South King County where a property manager sought to evict an adult child who was actually still in high school. But once the adult child turned 18, they weren't on the lease. The property manager would not allow the person to be placed on the lease and instead sought to evict. And I think it had to do with some interpersonal conflict between the property manager and the newly adult child in the family. So that kind of abuse was dealt with through a legal process or a statutory process in the city's code to prevent that from happening. And that's what the sort of where Right to Live with Family comes from. And then finally, prohibiting criminal background checks. That is a measure that has been adopted by the city of Seattle. It addresses equity concerns that perhaps experience in the criminal justice system is making it harder for individuals to get housing. So moving on, I wanted to also, partly in response to public comment today, is to note that the city of Kenmore is tonight, even as we speak, continuing its work on these issues and is deliberating additional items. But they did back earlier this year adopt a number of these actions that I just reviewed: the notice of rent increase, limits on move-in fees and security deposits, limits on late fees, giving tenants an ability to change the due date for rent, and barring not having a social security number or not providing a social security number as a grounds for not leasing a unit. Now, it is important to note that for the city of Kenmore, all of these protections, tenant protections, are enforced through what is known as a private right of action. That is to say that they are essentially defenses to eviction. So a tenant would need to, were they getting evicted or contesting a rent increase, they would need to go to court and assert their own legal rights through the legal system in order to address these injustices. So they have the tool now in the City of Kenmore Ordinance Toolkit, but those are things that they have to themselves enforce through the legal process. I will also note too that Kenmore is tonight is looking at 6 other issues that they asked staff to do more research on, including just cause eviction protection, a right to relocation for low-income tenants, a ban on abusive, deceptive, and unfair practices, the additional signatory measure, prohibition on criminal background checks, and a rental unit registration program. They are not considering a rental inspection program, however, and they are also looking at whether to exempt landlords from these coverages who own 4 or fewer units. So moving on to discussion, this staff report was organized around the model ordinance provided by the tenant advocates. It was really intended solely as an introduction to the topic as outlined in the staff report. And I want to be very clear, other stakeholders such as landlords have not been contacted, and that was by design since this was such a preliminary meeting. There are a series of questions that you as council can consider in this discussion. However, I'll pause here for any questions from council on the substance of what we're discussing tonight.
If that's concluded your presentation, Mr. Hammond, let's do that. Otherwise, why don't you go ahead and finish up, and then we'll do all one big discussion.
Okay, that sounds good. So just in the staff report, we suggested some questions, and these are just simply to get the ball rolling. They can be questions you wish to talk about or not, but certainly, would you like to spend further time staff researching and proposing a protection program for renters? Are you interested in directly hearing from key stakeholder groups? To what degree would you wish to provide staff support and information, to both landlords and tenants? And would you want to do that and have a proactive sort of enforcement arm versus establishing legal rights that can be enforced privately? And are there specific renter protections out of all of the cornucopia of options here that you would wish to explore further? So that is it. Questions and discussion.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hammond. Are there questions or comments from council? Deputy Mayor Robertson.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll get started. So I guess I want to acknowledge that I had this initial meeting with Will, who you heard from in public comment tonight, I think all the way back in February. And I want to acknowledge that because I did not get it on our council workshop agenda before that happened. And I should have brought it then. I didn't get it there in time. This should have been a conversation that we had then. And so I want to just acknowledge that and recognize the amount of work that Mr. Hammond and staff have done outside of our agreed upon work plan to bring this presentation to us tonight. So I acknowledge that. I don't like doing things outside of the work plan, but thank you for bringing this to us. So I guess then I'll jump into the questions of whether or not I want to invest, the questions you laid out for us. Do we want to invest more time? Ultimately, yes, I would like to see us answer some of these questions. I'm actually pretty interested in the list of items that you said Kenmore have already approved and the approach that they're taking. That tends to align with some of the items that were of most greatest importance to me at this point. And I also am very interested in having a robust stakeholder process. And if that is going to slow us down, then I recognize that that will slow us down. But I do think we need to hear from landlords. I do think we need to hear from renters and just all of the individuals that this would affect. So does that mean that it needs to happen right now, or should it wait until our next, council goal setting workshop and to fold it into a work plan? I could go either way, and I guess that depends on kind of the direction and the will of the council and how much consensus we have. Just one other note. When I read the report and when I think about some of the things that are most important to me, I will say that the ability to adjust the rent due date for tenants on fixed incomes is something that I think that would be really important to do, right away. And there are others, no rent increase if property is in poor condition. That's important to me. Obviously, that doesn't happen unless there's some kind of inspection, which puts in an infrastructure, question. So these are big questions, and I do want to find a way to give our renters some additional security. I don't want to do it at the expense of our single-family housing and mom and pop landlords and rental units that are in Shoreline. And I have heard anecdotally, not just from our public commenters tonight, but from other individuals I have who are experiencing these same challenges in cities like Seattle and other surrounding cities where these have been put in place. So that's just a first stab at the questions, and I look forward to hearing where the rest of the council is on this issue. Thank you so much.
Councilmember McConnell.
Yeah, thank you. So as a member of the council, I believe I'm the only one who has been a housing provider outside of, owning my own house, which I dwell in. So I do want to say a couple things about that, but let me start off with the fact that as a council an individual council member, the point of the council retreats that we have annually is to, as a group, decide what the work plan is for moving forward through staff. Every time we add something, it requires time and money of the staff. So we do this very carefully and respectfully. And back in the beginning of my council, the council was pretty wild about having, like so many goals that took up so much time that really we didn't have the resources to implement or to get to the end of it. And so with that kind of experience, I really enjoy that the councils in years after that have really respected the process that we have set up, which is to share individually what our desires are for the next coming year or two, and then vet it through our retreat. And so thank you, Deputy Mayor Robertson, for pointing out that we did not do that for this. And because of that, and because there's so much here, I feel really uncomfortable to adding this to a work plan for this year. It's not to say that I don't think that there are issues. I've been a landlord as a mom and pop's owner for 35 years. I've had an average of one turnover every 3 years. So if I did the math real quick, I've had touches with people who I'm going to rent to at least 60 times. And so I've really learned how to take some cues that to me make me feel good about the person I'm going to choose. And so that's not even in here. Credit is the one saving grace for all of us that we have to fall back on to protect our investment. So the fact that there are some policies already in there to make credit not the issue that not even the issue is not the right word, but for it not to be the cornerstone of what a housing provider can actually do makes me very nervous. And as I think former Councilmember Susan Chang also has some houses and units. I think they're multiplexes, but she did write to us, and she has experienced the fact that Seattle did implement a lot of these things, and they've had a significant reduction in what I would call single-family homes, and that is really the most affordable type of homes over multi-units because they're older, they're smaller, but they're still very desirable because this is the type of person who wants to live there really wants a home with some land around it, maybe even a fence, a neighborhood. So I think we need to be real careful about the unintended consequences of some of these policy changes because we really do want to keep affordable housing in Shoreline, and I clearly trust that what happens in Seattle is going to happen to us, and so it's going to actually not do what I believe the entire council wants these sort of things to help tenants, but we also don't want to take away the incentive for people to actually own these homes so they can be housing providers, because when you do that, then they have other options that are easier to deal with. So I'm going to leave that right now. And I have lots of other comments, but I definitely prefer to hear from other council members first. And thank you, Jim, for that great presentation.
Other questions or comments? Councilmember Povey, sorry. And then Councilmember Ramsdell after that. Yeah.
Oh, Mayor, okay. All right, thank you, Mayor. And of course, thank you, Mr. Hammond, for such a great presentation. Each time I think about Shoreline, I want to go back to what we say. We say it is an all-inclusive city. So regardless of background or social status, What we seek to do is to do what is in the best interest of the majority. And if you're so much involved in the city, I think most of these things are just morally right to put in place. And so it's good for us to discuss and arrive at, I want to say, a balanced, equitable, we all should arrive at a ground that is, just balanced for both landlords and renters. As someone who is involved in the community, I've had chats with at least 5 landlords and other renters, about 38, and some stories are heartbreaking. And so when it comes to critical things like this, it's about human life. And one thing that I'm concerned about is young people living in Shoreline that possibly won't be able to afford due to some of these policies not being in place and will move away. We can have others who can absolutely afford, but these people who can afford will never care for the city and won't make any impact, won't volunteer or even lift a finger when it comes to necessary things to be done for the city. So I think it's important that we think through thoroughly, and as I said, arrived at the balance, just have conversations about it, but it's disappointing to hear some say we don't want to talk about it, put it away, and all that. I totally don't agree. And so to answer the first question, will council want to at least move forward to add this to 2022, 2024? I will definitely go for it. And I want to just re-echo what Deputy Mayor Robertson said. Not necessarily picking everything and just slapping it on there, but going through and looking at the hanging fruits and making sure that we implement those to begin with. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Ramsdell.
Thank you, Mayor. I think Deputy Mayor Robertson and Councilmember Poby kind of reflected my sentiments on the issue. A couple of things I would like to add as I'm responding to the questions. First of all, last thing I want to see is small mom and pop landlords be forced to sell their homes and reduce the amount of affordable units in Shoreline. However, the eviction moratoriums are over. There's been a huge spike in rents since the end of the pandemic. My understanding is there's an increased complaints from renters of abusive landlords. And for that reason, I would like to add the work plan to like to add this item to the 2022-2024 work plan. I think of anything else. Some of the things that I think are really important is when we're talking about stakeholders, I do feel it's important, and Deputy Mayor Robertson mentioned this, I do think it's important to include renters in the conversation as well as landlords. I think all stakeholders have to have a voice. The other, I guess for me, the most critical protections are, the longer notice of rent increases, a cap on late fees, move-in fee cap and payment installments, and that was something that really I was very much liked what Kenmore was doing. And then closing the loophole for just cause evictions. And my understanding is that when a lease ends, some landlords are not renewing the lease, even though the tenant did nothing wrong. So that's essentially my answers to the questions. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember. Other comments? Councilmember Mork.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Hammond, for a thoughtful presentation. This is clearly a very complicated issue, one that I understand both sides. I've spent more than half my adult life as a renter, and I know many mom and pop landlords. The nice thing about mom and pop landlords, for instance, the auto mechanic that I know who has a property that he rents out, they really care about the individuals that they are leasing to, because they're together trying to solve a problem. And I think that it is really important that we approach this issue very, very carefully and understand the ramifications. Councilmember McConnell talked about unintended consequences. I think in American history we have a variety of instances where there's been unintended consequences, especially as related to landlord-tenant issues. So I really think we need to be careful. What Mr. Hammond said, though, that caused me some concern is he said, should we proceed with this, something would need to come off the table. And my concern is that we need to be very methodical. This needs to take time. I don't know what's going to come off the table. My hope is, Mr. Hammond, you could give us some idea of what that might be.
Councilmember Mork, I have to confess, I'm speaking theoretically. I don't have either the portfolio or the perspective to say X should come off in place of Y. I think council owns the to-do list and ultimately would.
Jim, if I could go ahead and interject.
Of course, please do.
Thank you. We haven't decided what we would need to take off. I think part of it is we wanted to hear what the council discussion was tonight. As council is aware, we don't have a like a housing office as such, and so we don't have anybody who's a specialist in this area, and many times we would have like a management analyst maybe start to take this on, but they are tapped out on items. So we'd have to go back and just do some more discussion to see if there's something else that could be put on hold. I would say if council is wanting us to move forward, but there isn't a time sensitive, and when I say that, I mean that there's flexibility of when this would come back in the future, then that probably gives us more leeway. And I recognize it may not be as immediate as some council members would want, but at least that would give us some flexibility at looking at the long-term work plan. But so we have not made a decision of what would come off if this were to come on, because I think we wanted to hear what council's interest was in this and areas that you would want to see focused on.
Thank you, Ms. Terry. The key part that I think was in your answer is it is not that staff is sitting around wondering what to do next, that there is we would need to make room for it. And to me, that means that we should plan and schedule this at a time when we have the resources to do it. I do not know if that means it's the 2022 to 2024 time period. I'm really concerned about the levy lid lift, which is our next discussion. I know we're doing budget this year. I'm really concerned that there needs to be adequate bandwidth for this topic that is very complicated and impacts so many people. I'm very sensitive, however, to concerns raised about the impact of the pandemic on tenants and on landlords, and I'd like to understand more about that. So quickly going through the questions that was asked, do I think we need to invest time? Absolutely. This is a topic that is clearly of interest, but I'm not sure right now. In fact, I would, unless I was convinced that there was some way to fit it in, I would vote no for right now. Should all stakeholder groups be represented? Absolutely. It's really important to have both landlords and tenants and advocacy groups on both sides that can help us understand that. I really am interested. Mr. Banneker talked about the number of small landlords and the impact to Seattle for having so many come out of the market. And that was also mirrored by another one of our speakers. And so I'd like to make sure that, that there's consideration given to that. And thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember. Other questions or comments? Councilor Roberts, you haven't weighed in. Would you like to?
Oh, sure.
Don't usually have to beg people to comment, but.
No, I'm largely of two minds on this. On one hand, and I think importantly, the proposals that are before us intuitively make a lot of sense. And I really hope, I mean, even if we don't do anything today, I hope that we include some of these in our legislative priorities, because I think many of these should be addressed by the state legislature. The tenants in Shoreline, tenants in Edmonds deserve the same protections. And because especially as tenants, as renters, city lines, you go to where housing is affordable. You go to where you have access to transit, have access to jobs, have access to other sorts of resources. And this, especially if you don't have children or you're not committed to necessarily one particular school district, the choice of where you live is sort of much broader than sort of one particular jurisdiction. When I was first was looking at housing back in 2007, sort of up in this area as I was moving 2000, from the U district. It's been a long. But I mean, what I did was I was still working and teaching at the University of Washington as a student there. And when I was looking at sort of housing, I was like, okay, where do the bus lines go from the University of Washington? I did not at that moment want to continue to live in the U district, and I wanted to see where I could go. And so my housing search was, so where are the bus lines? And where could I gain access to? And at that point, Shoreline was sort of just another city on the map. If I lived 300 feet further north, I'd be in Edmonds at that time. Just a different transit provider, and actually was taking community transit more than I was Metro because of how far north I lived. So the protection. So the point is sort of that the protections are important for Shoreline tenants and renters at this moment, but what we're talking about and what advocates have been pushing for ought to be the statewide standard. So I say that sort of recognizing there's a few issues that with what Kenmore has proposed and what Kenmore has adopted, and what we need to actually make sure that tenants actually get and receive the protections that they deserve. I was sort of looking things up over the past few hours, and just sort of according to one study, somewhere around 90% of low-income residents nationwide do not have adequate access to the legal system. They're not represented by attorneys. They don't have access to attorneys. They're not able to afford attorneys. They even are maybe turned down from attorneys for relatively small cases. So when we talk about sort of the problem I have and the challenge I have with Kenmore's ordinance is that it relies on this private right of action, as Mr. Hammond mentioned in the staff report. And if you don't have access to an attorney, the rights that we put on paper, the rights that we adopt, are not necessarily available to everyone. There's a few attorneys who serve and have served on the city council. How many, I mean, when we're looking at relatively small dollar sort of fines and penalties, how many attorneys are necessarily going to put in the work to necessarily provide and try to receive remedies for their clients when they're, again, relatively low dollar amounts? Someone who violates the code in Kenmore around having an excessive move-in fee, I mean, it could be $1,000, which is huge for a renter. But how many? The question is, how many attorneys are going to sort of take the time and do the research and then seek that remedy? And then also just that sort of access to the courts, there's a problem, just sort of a general problem there. If you're undocumented or have some other issue that you're not able to go to the courts and unwilling to use the court system, how does a private right of action sort of help you? So, I mean, these are some of the issues that are concerning with that model. And the only way I think needs to work is the city needs to do that, to be that work, to be that lever, to be that enforcement, to go out to say to a landlord, you are violating our ordinance, here's a civil infraction. The city is the one who enforces the legislation. So, I mean, I think that's the big piece, and it's sort of, these rights are important. They're important for renters, but the challenge is, how do we make sure, the ultimate challenge is, how do we make sure those residents are able to have those rights realized? So, and that's the big problem. And so having the state do it, having the state be that sort of adopt the laws, that means the state is the enforcement agency. That the state can actually do it and use the power of the state to make sure that landlords are in compliance and keep landlords in compliance. It's much harder for a city, especially I will say in this instance, a relatively small city like Shoreline. The sort of other question is sort of revolves around some of the claims that were put forward during public comment about sort of how many landlords are sort of, we'll use the sort of mom and pop type description, how many units are mom and pop type landlords versus other types of landlords. We don't really have the data. I mean, both either, and I haven't seen the data at least. We do know that just this past week or so, Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell vetoed legislation that would require landlords to provide information to the city of Seattle. And there's a few reasons why the mayor of Seattle did that, but without the data, we don't really, we are hearing and we are relying on anecdotes. And so when we try to solve problems, we should try to get data as best as we can so we can actually tailor our policies towards the actual problem and not necessarily sort of what we've heard. And we've heard council members sort of talk about sort of, there are good sort of mom and pop landlords, but if we exclude the sort of small landlords, and they're 75% or so of the rental market, that's a lot of people we're not protecting. So we have to grapple with with a lot of issues. These are not simple in the sort of sense that these are good. I mean, yes, I mean, I do agree. These are good policies and I think reasonable landlords would and should and ought to take into account. But are they? I don't. I'm starting to ramble here, but we have to sort of think about sort of inclusivity of everything. If we exclude one group of landlords, what does it mean? What does it mean for the protections that we're trying to do? So, Mayor, you asked for my comments, and I don't really have great comments except in this case, I do want to hope the state takes action. And I'm missing. There's a third point I was trying to get. I have forgotten, but this is important. I mean, these are important issues. We do need to make sure that the individual. Oh, I do remember what my point was. It is many of the problems that we face is we have a housing shortage in Shoreline and in the region, and it's not. You can't just sort of waving a magic wand and sort of building more housing is not going to solve all of these challenges. But many of the things around rent increases and are affected by the housing stock and how much available housing stock we have. And so I'm very proud that Shoreline is taking and saying, please build. You need housing. This is why we need housing, not just sort of around our arterials and our stations, but why duplexes, triplexes, accessory dwelling units in our neighborhoods are important, so we can build the housing stock so people have more options of where to live and how to raise their families. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Let me weigh in a bit, and then I'll sum up what I think I heard, and then give council a chance to weigh in if you disagree with my summary. So I don't do landlord-tenant law, but I have, through various mechanisms, become pretty familiar with 59.18, which is the state's law on it. And in my view, it's pretty robust. There's a fair amount of protections that are already baked into it. Many of the things that we're discussing here are already in the state law in some form. So we talk about barring rent increases if property is in poor condition. There's already a provision in state law which lets you withhold rent if the property is defective or dangerous. And that means it doesn't have heat, it doesn't have plumbing, the electric's bad, there's mold, that kind of thing. So we would sort of redefine that to make it poor condition. We'd have to come up with a definition for that. You can't just say poor condition, because what does that mean? So we would have to reinvent the wheel on it and provide a separate protection, which is no rent increase. That to me doesn't really get us any better off than what we've already got under state law. Just cause, the state adopted that, and maybe it's a loophole between 6 and 12 months, but although I'm sure the legislature does have oopses occasionally, usually things like that are worked out and hammered out with all the stakeholders, and it's not an accident that it came that way. And if we see a flood of 8-month leases and we have a giant problem that there is a huge cadre of people who are excluded from it, then my hope is the legislature would pick that up in this coming session. And maybe we will have to backfill it if we do have that avalanche of problems, but I'm not seeing it. Other stuff in here, there's a state law 60-day notice of rent increase. We would go to 120. Again, I'm not sure that's a material difference. The right to live with family concerns me because you have someone who's a problem who wouldn't be allowed to live in an apartment or a home on their own because they have bad behaviors. You can backdoor that person in by letting them live with their mom or their third cousin or whatever else. So essentially, I mean, I agree with all the conceptual things that were addressed here, that this is absolutely about human dignity and life and all the rest, but I'm not sure that this level of fairly granular detail moves the needle enough for me to want to modify our work plan. And I'd also like to see the state law, which was just revamped. It was literally either last year or the year before that Just Cause and a few of the other changes came in. I'd like to see that operate for a bit and sort of see over time whether we really have the emergency that I think, people perceive there as. So what I heard from council, obviously we all have our own unique take on it. I don't think any of us was in complete agreement on where we're at. But what I heard is Deputy Mayor Robertson, Council Members Popey and Ramsdell would like to see it move forward on the existing work plan. With reservations and cautions, I believe the other 4 of us would prefer to see it set over to the next year's retreat, where we can have a more robust staff report and we can have a more robust discussion in an informal environment about what we move forward with. So I'll now turn it back over to council. If anybody disagrees with my assessment or wants to add anything, please do. Councilmember Roberts.
Thank you, Mayor. I think it'd be helpful to inform our discussion to as much resources as can be allocated within existing resources to help us with the data of what's happening in Shoreline. Whether that's using and looking at third-party sources. I think trying to get a good grasp of what is happening within our city is going to be helpful in that future discussion. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Does anyone else disagree with my summary or want to add anything else? Councilmember Povey.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Not to disagree, but just to look at it from a different perspective with a 60-day notice. So if a rent is going to be increased by 1.5%, 60-day notice, I think is fair. But if a rent is going to be increased by 10%, I don't think it is fair to give 60-day notice because that increase doesn't happen on the salary side of the individual renting the house. So, and it doesn't give room for the individual to look for another place where this person can afford. In the month of May, I had, a horrible encounter with a single mom who rents 1 bedroom, $1,500. The landlord says, I'm going to increase with $250 more, so $1,750 for 1 bedroom, single mom. and gives the woman 3 weeks, 21 days. I was heartbroken because that's inhuman, and we look at it from that perspective. So it could be both ends. She could have given 20-day notice that I'm getting out, and so it affects the landlord as well. So I think if we can come in with percentages and say, well, if it's 10%, 180 days, if it's 5%, 120 days, and not just stick with the 60 days. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember McConnell.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, if we're going to start talking anecdotal, I could tell you all kinds of stories that landlords have basically don't have the rights actually that tenants have, and you get one tenant who knows how to manipulate that, and it's a nightmare for owner of a home. I move very swiftly. It still takes me 2 months to evict somebody who has quit paying rent. And so if I've gotten first, last, and deposit, I'm still not even breaking even. So, and anecdotally, I have never bumped up the rent more than 5% because I want to keep the people who are there. Also, I think many of us have some, I don't know, compassion, whatever you want to call it, that if we have the ability to raise it 10 or 20, most of us don't, because we wouldn't want that to happen to us. And in Seattle, you have to give 2 months notice for a certain percentage or over when your rent increases. So I might agree to that but I think anecdotally, I have never done that. And the moratorium was, suppressed my rents for 2 years. And I was fine with that because that was my part in helping people not worried about where they're going to live in a crisis where people's earnings, jobs were being, literally pulled out from underneath them. But places like Hope Link, which I am on the board, have programs to help people who can't come up with all of that money, because that is the big hurdle for many people, first, last, and a deposit. But there are programs that help people have that money. But if you at some point when you can't afford the rent, even the 1.5% late fee, that's not an incentive for somebody to want to turn themselves around. It's just an incentive to stay there as long as they can until they are, legally asked to leave. So I've been very generous and compassionate. Like I said, the most I've ever increased was 4 or 5%. Usually I round down, and so the only time I have a big rent increase would be the opportunity when somebody's already moving out. So the new people are getting what I would call the market rate, which is different than what I was giving somebody who just moved out. Most of the people I know who own rentals are like that. So don't put us all in the, we're the bad guys, because this moratorium was really incredibly hard for both sides. If you owned a few places and you had two, even one household that didn't pay for a year or two and you couldn't replace them, I think many people have to sell their properties because they financially couldn't survive. So I hope the council can look at it with the same passion from both sides. And I believe, Mayor Scully, to get to your point, I believe you summarized it accurately, that there were 4 of us who wanted to not put it on the plan right now because we had a retreat. And if we start breaking our house rules, then every one of us could, start doing that, regardless of whether it's a crisis or not. And that's that's the difficulty of being on council. When something comes up, we should have done it, but if we didn't, we have to find other means, probably that are less onerous in terms of staff time, or we're really, Ms. Terry mentioned, we don't have a housing department. That's going to require an FTE minimum, whether they're sitting in their office waiting for a call or not. This is a whole different area of expertise that we do not have anybody really in our ranks to do that. So in order to do it well, I do believe we should put it on the plan for next year and really have a great, robust retreat about it, and also have both sides of the argument educate us, because we still need a lot of education in this manner to make sure that we don't do something that has unintended consequences that we didn't see beforehand. So thank you, Mayor.
Other questions or comments from council? No. All right, Ms. Terry, do you have enough? All right, okay, thank you. We'll conclude this item, and we're on to study item 8B, which is the 10-year financial sustainability plan. And I believe Ms. Lane is here in person.
Now I have to remember how to get all my tools set up in person. It's a whole new world. Okay, good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council. It's a pleasure to be back with you in person. I am looking forward to this. Anyway, tonight I am here to provide you with an update on our 10-year financial sustainability plan with a focus on strategy number 7, our levy lid lift. So, in addition to providing...
is the mic on there? Can the folks on...
I forgot about that. I've got to be closer.
Yeah, and can the folks on remote, you can hear okay? Okay, great.
Can you hear
I wasn't hearing
okay.
you broadcast.
Okay.
Right, please proceed.
See, little nuances, got to be closer to the mic. Okay. In addition to providing an update on the 10-year financial sustainability plan, there are 2 policy questions that we would like council's input on tonight. The first is whether the city should place a levy lid lift on the November 2022 general election ballot. And if the answer is yes, then the second question is, what should the first year rate be, and how should the levy be lifted in each subsequent year? So I'm going to start by providing some background on the 10-year financial sustainability plan, which was adopted in 2014. It was with that adoption, we established the use of our 10-year financial sustainability model that allows us to project revenues and expenditures out for 10 years. The plan included 7 strategies that needed to be implemented for financial sustainability. We have implemented all 7 of those strategies at this point, and they are currently in use. This included things like cost recovery strategies for our fee-based services, the implementation of a B&O tax, and what we're here primarily to talk about is strategy number 7, which is the use of a levy lid lift that we'll talk about more. So, levy lid lifts. You probably recall that the state law caps our annual levy so that we are not allowed to increase our actual levy by more than 1% or the percentage of the increase of the implicit price deflator unless voters have approved a levy lid lift. A voter-approved levy lid lift can last 6 years. And with the levy lid lift, we reset the rate in the first year, and then each subsequent year is increased by either a set amount or a set percentage, or it can be tied to an index like CPIU, which is what the city has used historically. So the city has had 2 successful levy lid lifts. 2010, voters passed that, and they set the rate at $1.48 per 1,000 of assessed value. And the second rate was set at $1.39. Both of those annual lifts were tied to CPIU. Our current levy lid lift is due to expire at the end of December of this year. So as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the first policy question council needs to consider is whether or not to place the levied lid lift on the ballot. And to help in that discussion, the city manager convened the 2022 Financial Sustainability Advisory Committee earlier this year. We had 13 residents. They met 6 times to discuss the levied lid lift. During that meeting, they got to see presentations both on our financial status as well as hearing from departments on the services that we provide and the emerging issues that the departments are facing. So the committee made several recommendations to the city manager. They reached consensus on the recommendation that council should place a levied lid lift on the ballot. They also recommended that the levy should maintain the level of city services. There were differing opinions on whether the city should expand services with the levied lid lift. Their final report, which includes a lot more information, was attached to tonight's staff report. The committee did not make a recommendation on the first-year levy rate, and there was no members that supported a no action alternative. So to help with the discussion tonight, or if council, we have come up with 4 options plus a no action scenario that I'll review with you now so that you can see what the impacts might be. First is the no action option. If council chooses not to place the levied lid lift on the ballot, or if voters did not support the levied lid lift, the new levy rate would be projected to be $1.02 per 1,000 of assessed value. And then it would increase by the 1% annual RCW limitation or the implicit price deflator, whichever is less. Our current forecast anticipates a shortfall where forecasted expenditures would exceed revenue starting in 2024 in this scenario. Of course, that would not happen because by law we are required to adopt a balanced budget. So this would require that we either find other revenue sources or fill with fund balance or most likely reduce expenditures, which means reduction of services. So of the 4 options that we'll discuss that do include the levied lid lift, option 1 would enhance program service levels to address the emerging issues that have been identified and fully fund support services for current operational programs. Emerging issues that would be include human services and housing support, including radar program for the North King County Mobile Crisis Response, so this would provide 24/7 response in Shoreline. It would add recreation programming. It would also include enhancements to the city's urban forestry program. And it would maintain programming service levels for code enforcement, recreation, and park maintenance. Support service levels would also be enriched by adding positions in information technology, human resources, and legal, as well as finance operations. In option 2, which is the staff recommendation given the rate impacts, at this rate, it sets the rate at $1.40. And it would add some services, so it would add the Regional Mobile Crisis Response Program. It would partially fund the support services that we mentioned before, so it would have some information technology increase, some human resources increase, and it would support some park maintenance staff increases after the new properties would be improved. It would not provide funding to maintain service levels in other areas such as code enforcement or recreation. In option 3, the levy rate would be set at $1.35. This option would balance the city budget over the 6-year period, but it does not provide any new services or additional programs for the support services. So as such, we would see service levels effectively decreased due to increasing costs and demands for services, such as increases in the city's assets, implementation of new and updated regulations. And then option 4 resets the rate for 2023 to $1.08, which is the same rate as the projected no action rate, and it raises the levy lid each subsequent year by CPI. While this option would generate approximately $10 million more than the no action process, it still projects that expenditures would exceed revenues in 2024. And it would create a shortfall of $12.6 million over the 6-year levy lid lift. So again, that would require a reduction in services or increase in other revenues or use of fund balance. So this slide, and we can come back to this during discussion if it's helpful, but this slide is a summary that shows the levy rates of the 4 options that we applied. It shows what the difference is, the impact is to the medium-priced homeowner for the full year and the monthly average over the 6 years. And it also shows surpluses and deficits that would be created with that option. As a reminder, the surpluses that are created every year with this are used, that's considered one-time revenues, and one-time revenues are used to support critical one-time projects. A good example of that is the city's contribution to the city maintenance facility that currently we anticipate needing an additional over $20 million to help fund over the life of that project. So for next steps, if council chooses to move forward with a potential levy lid lift, council would next discuss the potential legislation on June 27th and take action on that legislation on July 11th. If you pass the resolution, then you would appoint a pro and a con member on July 25th, and they would write the pro and con statements for the voter pamphlet, and the item would be on our November 8th election. So there is no immediate financial impact associated with tonight's discussion. This is a long-range financial perspective, but the 10-year financial sustainability does project potential budget gaps beginning in 2024 with a cumulative budget deficit of almost $23 million. And the city is required to pass a balanced budget, which we have done every year following our policies, which is that current revenues will support current expenditures and that one-time revenues are used for one-time purposes such as projects. So staff recommends that council direct staff to prepare the legislation and other materials necessary to place the levy lid lift on the ballot. And we are seeking your direction about what services should be included in the levy lid lift, which impacts the levy rate. So with that, I can either go back to the summary slide. There we go.
Thank you. And I apologize for going first, but I have a question I think might help guide the discussion. We currently have a levy lid lift in effect. It expires. My understanding of this slide is that no action would remove that, and so taxes would actually decrease. Is that accurate?
Exactly. If the levy lid lift would just expire at the end of the year, and they would recalculate the rate, which results in a decrease in our rate down to $1.02.
Okay, so we've got 6-year monthly average difference to no action. That looks like a tax increase based upon what people are paying now. What is the current levy rate, so that we can compare what people are paying now to what we might be asking them to pay in the first year with this levy lid lift?
Thank you. I'm going to, and I should have that in my notes here, but I'm going to phone a friend. I have Christy, and Christy and Christina are both on the line. Christy, can you tell me what our current levy rate is?
You're literally phoning a friend.
Literally.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Yes, sorry, I'm looking at it right now.
I have a number in my head, but I hesitate to throw it out there.
Sorry, my spreadsheet's opening.
Mrs.
It's $1.13.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
And that was the number I had in my head, but I didn't trust myself.
So for the next presentation, could we have an additional column added?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. All right, and I apologize, Council, for going first. I thought that might help guide the discussion. Are there comments or questions from staff? So for Council, for staff. Councilor Pope.
Thank you, Mayor. I loved reading all this stuff, good stuff. Thank you for that. Option 4 is where my question is left by CPI only. So we are projecting a shortfall of about 12 million, right? And thinking of using fund balance to budget the budget. Why do you think that's a good option?
Oh, I do not believe that that's a good option. It's not a sustainable option to use fund balance. We could possibly use fund balance to delay reductions, but we could not sustain. We couldn't, I think that would not be that would not be my recommendation. So this was put out there as because the rate is obviously would be a lower impact for our residents, and that's why we thought it certainly is an option, but it would require reduction in services and expenditures over the period.
I might have heard wrong because I thought you said that is the option that staff goes for, and I was like,
no,
okay,
option 2 is the staff recommendation. Option 2.
Thank you.
Which does increase some critical services and some support services, but does not do everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Roberts.
Thank you, Mayor. I do support option 2 as what's being presented here. In large part because I think that funding enhancing the radar program, the North King County Regional Mobile Crisis Response Program is really important for our community. And I think that's when we talk about issues around public safety, when we think about we don't have our citizen satisfaction survey yet. I wish we did, but I think that you'll find that my guess is that you'll find is that people do want to see an increased level of sense of public safety, but we do recognize that in order to really sort of have safety, we need to. Public safety is not entirely a police issue. It is all of these other issues, and we need dedicated people that can help and direct people to services. My only quibble with what is presented is I think that it's up to the council to determine what programs will be enhanced and that's through our budget processes, rather than sort of saying what these funds are going to be for in the levy itself. It's us, the council, that makes determinations on budget levels and funding levels for all sorts of departments, and we set the rate and the taxes and fees that will go towards these programs. Having that spelled out in the levy, I think, is generally problematic because it ties the hands of future councils. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Ms. Lane, did you have a response?
I agree with your comment that the council certainly gets to set the rate, and how we describe this, describe what would be covered is what will be our limiting factor. So we'll need to be very careful on how we draft that, and we're working with bond counsel now to make sure that, and of course Margaret's involved. So at the same time, we needed something to sort of lay out how to get to a rate, what could be included. And so that's where we created our menu of options.
And Mayor, if I might respond.
Let's see if Ms. Terry has a comment. She looked. And then, please.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I'm going to add too much more than what Sarah just said, but totally agree. The council does get to make those decisions. These are probably reflective of what you would see as the city manager recommendation, as far as, again, to help quantify what we're looking at, but certainly that would be ultimately be your decision. And I would not anticipate that the actual bond measure language would get that specific. We wouldn't be looking at like identifying HR and IT, there. So it was to help provide some context for conversation, but no argument from the staff perspective on council's role in the budget authority. So,
thank you. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Ms. Terry and Ms. Lane. I think that when we do draft that language, I think I would want us to be very careful about what we're saying in that, because at least for me, I think code enforcement is a big thing and something that we have not done well, and I think we can do better. But some of the limitations there is funding. But that's a discussion that I want to have with the council during the budget process, rather than sort of categorically excluding that here. But I do appreciate what was, we do need some, staff needed some parameters to get to a rate and recommendation here. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councilmember McConnell.
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Lane, I know that you recommended option 2. Is that because you tend to be on the conservative side of it? What are you really uncomfortable with option 1 as the finance person? And that's one question. What I'm seeing here is that the differential between option 1 and 2 per month is small compared to being able to have almost 8 more staff people, which is probably going to be pretty noticeable for people who come and do work with city staff. And with a growing city, because MUR 70 is going to just send us through the roof here in just less than a half dozen years. I personally would like to be proactive about it. However, I want to listen to the rest of the council because I clearly will be supporting option 2, but I'm leaning toward option 1 as the real deal for moving into our light rail city with all these new people that are coming and really having a staff that can handle all the growth and all the the touches with the community that we're going to have. So the first question was, how uncomfortable do you feel about option 1? Thank you.
I personally think my biggest concern with option 1 would be voter acceptance. And then there is a slightly higher risk should assessed valuations decrease that we would hit the $1.60 cap. That has happened to us before. I don't know how large of a risk that is. We were at $1.48 before, and we came through that. But I think my primary hesitation, and I think as you might ask Ms. Terry the same question, but I think that was the voter acceptance was probably more at the $1.40.
Ms. Terry. Sorry, Ms. Terry.
I think that's very true. I know in the last levy lid lift, we went to $1.39. I heard council during the council goal setting workshop talk about comfort level around the same rate as the 2016 levy. I think it's important to remember it's not just the rate, it is the valuation of housing. So, even going from the current rate to $1.40, is that increase in property taxes. I also think that our projections are conservative, although I think, fairly telling of what the future would look like, and hopefully maybe there will be some additional budget flexibility. We'd have to wait and see. Would we love to go to option one? Yes. But I think just in looking and weighing and balancing everything, it seemed more reasonable, in my opinion, for us to make a recommendation at option two. So.
Thank you. Anything further, Councilmember McConnell? No? Okay.
No, except I do know that we always grapple with one option and then the other. And I do believe that we are in a six-year period, which is so unlike any 6-year period that we're moving toward. So, and we have always passed these, again, because we're thoughtful. And I do understand our hesitancy, because we all are like, we all get that way. We don't want it to fail. But with the monthly differential and what we're going to get from it, it seems worth, for me personally, the risk. And again, I have not heard from other council members, and I will totally support the majority of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Robertson.
Thank you, Mayor. The conversation is already going, I think, where I was going to go, but a couple of comments. How is it that the committee was able to get done with their work without making a recommendation? I kind of feel like that kind of missed the goal.
Well, we spent a lot of time doing departmental presentations, and so I think that if they could have had a few more meetings, that they may have gotten to a dollar recommendation. I will also note that we updated the forecast we were using when we were meeting with them was the same forecast we used in the mid-biennial update, and that we presented to council. And then we knew we needed to update the forecast with the changing environment, and so that complicated things as well.
Another question I had was just looking at some of the additional strategies, right? So before we got to the levy lid lift and we looked at additional strategies, the housing stock, the commercial development, we're outpacing the goals that we set. So at what point does that make up some of the gap?
It happens very incrementally, and we do include some growth for development in our forecast, but it's never going to fill the gap. So that is something I think everybody, we would like it to, but the reality is there are costs. So the costs associated with that development increase just as faster than the revenues that go along with them. They sometimes trail. So
then I think, much like Councilmember McConnell, I'm comfortable. I mean, I appreciate the recommendation of option 2, and if that's where we go, that's great. But you really had me at option 1 when you start listing things like, as Councilmember Roberts said, code enforcement, urban forestry, and of course the 24-hour crisis line. So I understand what Councilmember Roberts is saying about how these things end up in our budget. It does mean a lot to me to know that, if we set the number at a certain rate, we are more likely to be able to have certain things in our budget than others. So those are important things to me. I think they are also very important things to our community. And so that's why I think I could be comfortable with either of those two options. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Further questions or comments? Yeah, Councilmember Ramsdell.
Thank you, Mayor. I am in support of option 2. For both political and practical reasons. My one kind of question is around what I'm concerned about is for folks who are on fixed incomes, and what's going to happen when how are they going to be impacted, and will the city be able to provide some level of support to folks with fixed incomes who can't afford, that increase in property taxes?
We can include an exemption for senior, low income, and disabled in our resolution, so that they would be eligible to apply for that.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Mork.
Thank you, Mayor. I have some questions that I don't quite understand. What impact does population growth have on this? Is there any?
Well, the population growth that comes along with development, as I mentioned, it is included in the forecast at a low level with the expectation that costs increase along with that population growth, and that the revenues also increase. So, so it's incorporated into the forecast.
And it's basically a wash.
Yes, well, and maybe a little less than a wash initially. Over time, I do think it washes, but it takes time.
Thank you, Ms. Lane. My second question dealt with the review of the city fees. Was that you indicated was done in 2010? Has it been done since?
Actually, I think we had the recreation fees they're actually reviewed regularly, but council accepted recommendations on the target recovery rates in 2015, I believe, and then they now follow those and they review the rates regularly. And our planning and community development cost recovery was conducted in 2017, I believe it was 2017, and was intended to be done this year, but due to turnover, it's getting pushed off until next year.
So could that be part of, is that something that can be part of the levy lift, or is it something we do in parallel path?
It's a separate sustainability option to make sure that we are charging fees that achieve council goals regarding cost recovery. So, for example, in the permitting, there are certain permits that we recognize we want people to get, and so maybe our cost recovery targets will be lower for those permits, because if they get too cost prohibitive, people will just do the work without the permit. But for others, 100% cost recovery is the target. And the same thing in recreation programs, where we have the most public benefit for that program. Then we have the lower level of cost recovery. Where there's more individual benefit, we have a higher cost recovery. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it generates two more questions. My apologies, Mayor. The first one is, if you do get, let's say for argument's sake, that the cost recovery for the planning department ends up being some number that is reasonably significant, where does that money go?
Our development fees are all part of the general fund.
So would it, in essence, be moving us toward option one?
Well, they're really separate. They're separate, although what would happen if we set our fees and we have, let's say we have more revenue than what we had budgeted or forecasted, then, and expenditures were equal, then that would create fund balance, which would then be considered a one-time revenue. So we need to make sure that whatever the revenue source is, that it's sustainable and ongoing before we fund ongoing services. So that's a key, is that we just want to make sure that whatever we're using to fund FTEs that are going to be here for a long time is ongoing revenue, not one-time revenue.
I'll have to follow up with you later on that, because I'm not sure I understand. Perhaps I can use an example. It's my understanding that the Parks and Recreation summer programs are totally full. Is that true?
I believe that is true. Generally, our summer camps have very large waiting lists.
Or option two, that keeps the status quo, and option one would increase it?
Exactly. It would add additional recreation staff that could manage more programs.
If I could just add, though, there are some limitations, because with space availability. So I just want to make sure that we understand that even with some additional recreation opportunities, we may not be able to enhance like summer camps because we do have limitations on where we can hold those. We've expanded them into some existing parks. So I don't know that we could say exactly if we could meet all the waiting list, if that was the original, thought that you had, Councilmember Mark.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand what the difference is between the two using an example. So thank you for helping me understand that. I would agree with many of my colleagues that option 2 certainly seems to be the lowest part that we would want to go. There are, I think, real concerns on various needs for the city that are coming in. I am concerned about option 1 as being, I can understand the dilemma, let's put it like that, is I do think that there are avenues that we could well use the additional funding, but I'm concerned that there is also ramifications on the opposite side. And I am going to attempt to learn more before our next meeting on this topic to understand the one-time projects and how that all fits into the situation. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further comments or questions? No. All right. So I just want to add my comments. I also generally support option 2, although I'm okay with option 1. I don't think there's going to be a big difference in voter approval. My concern with option 1 is that I don't want us to hit that $1.60, because then we have to figure out how to deal with that, and we draw from reserves, or it potentially creates a problem. Whereas at $1.40, my understanding from years of listening to these presentations is that we are very unlikely to hit $1.60. Yeah. I agree with the senior and disabled exception. I think we should put that in there. My belief on that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that that doesn't tend to decrease overall revenues significantly, although for individuals that can obviously make a huge difference. Is that accurate?
Say that one more time,
Sorry.
The first part.
That our historical usage of senior and disabled exemption has not significantly impacted revenues.
Correct.
Okay. What's the next steps?
Would be to direct staff to return with a proposed legislation to place this on the ballot on June 27th.
All right. I counted more folks supporting option 2 than option 1. No one seemed to want to take no action. Can you bring it back as a choice between the two?
Sure.
All right. Is there any disagreement from council on that? Proceeding that way? No. Okay. All right. All right. Seeing approval, when will this come back to us?
Great. June 27th.
Okay. Fantastic.
Okay. We'll see you then.
All right. So our next meeting is canceled due to the Juneteenth holiday. So our next time we convene will be the 27th, and we will pick this up anew, and we are adjourned. Thank you all.